good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are in the country. We're excited to be here to share our presentation that we've partnered, Publicis Media and Adsmovil have partnered to dive deeper into the Hispanic journey, specifically when we think about the financial category. This is coming off of our second partnership and study that was focused on the Hispanic purchase journey. As we go into the presentation, a little bit of housekeeping. Feel free to utilize the Q&A function within the presentation. We'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation. We'll go ahead and answer them specifically within the slide or when we see the questions come up. And with that being said, we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves. My name is Steven Paez. I oversee multicultural investment and innovation at Publicis Media. I've been with Publicis for close to 11 years now, and in the industry for close to 20 years. So I know I don't look it, so everyone could be surprised by that, but it's an honor and pleasure to be here with my co-presenter and great friend, Maria.
Thanks, Stephen. The humility is amazing. We're so excited to be here. Thanks for joining us. Stephen and I are both very committed to the Hispanic market, obviously, and to uncovering insights at every turn. So we're super excited about this study. I have been in this space for a little over 20 years. Unlike my co-presenter here, I know I look it, but I really enjoy this space, and I am currently Chief Marketing Officer at Adsmovil, and together we worked with ThinkNow to execute the research of the study, and we'll share findings in a minute.
Thank you. It's the wisdom, Maria. It's the wisdom.
That's what it is.
Before we dive into the presentation, just a little bit about our respective companies. Publicis Media, specifically our cultural quotient practice, is a leader in the space. We have more than 3 decades of history. We sit at the center amongst the brands and the different verticals within our group overall. We have expertise across various verticals. In addition, very honored to sit here with Maria and Adsmovil to bring forward some of those expertise, specifically under research and measurement, but also across other areas such as partnerships, thought leadership, and cultural expertise.
Thanks, Stephen. And again, I'm with Adsmovil. We are about super serving the multi-generational Hispanic cohort. We're a Hispanic first digital media company focused on the Hispanic market. We've been in this space for a little over 11 years. We're minority owned and certified. We reach 65% of the total digital Hispanic population. We have omni-channel offerings across our 2,500 plus Hispanic digital publishers. We provide data strategy for clients, custom high impact solutions. We have an AVOD offering called Nuestra TV, which is owner operated and for the Hispanic market, again, across acculturation levels. We also have digital out of home solutions, and we're very much focused on saving the environment. So we have a relationship with Saving the Amazon. So let's get into the study and the why. So when we first started talking about this study, we were very interested in uncovering insights about Hispanic financial consumers, right? How are they the same and how are they different than the general market? And more importantly, how are they distinct across acculturation levels and across ages? We took this approach in our last study. Again, we partner with ThinkNow. And when we use the terms acculturation, high, medium, and low, it's all tied to their time in the US, the language they use at home, how they identify themselves, and their media habits. So the study was executed early fall this year. We had a base of 600 respondents, 18 plus, half were Hispanic, half were non-Hispanic. This was an online national panel, and it was representative of the total Hispanic populace. So it mirrored the populace in terms of country of origin, for example. The ages we studied were Millennials, Gen Xers, and Boomers, and acculturation levels low, medium, and high. And again, we did this in partnership with ThinkNow, who we worked with in our previous study on digital purchasing. So we're going to share some findings across different categories. First, we're going to talk about the complexity of Hispanics and finances. Then we're going to share some results in terms of what financial products and services do they have, planning for the future, what's needed, and some takeaways and brand recommendations for all of our listeners today. Stephen?
Yes, thank you. So going first into our first section to discuss the complexity of Hispanics and finances. I'm going to start with some good news, Maria. Hispanics are less likely to feel anxious about their finances than their non-Hispanic peers. More than 2/3 of Hispanics feel that they're less anxious about their finances than their non-Hispanic counterparts. So, that lower number definitely represents that lower anxiousness when we think about it. And then we'll go deeper into these findings, definitely.
And let's talk about that for a second, right? Because I think one of the things that we also wanted to do with this study was to debunk any of that mythology that's out there about the Hispanic financial consumer. And this is one of the first findings that really surprised us, right? I for sure walked into this study thinking that we'd see Hispanics were more anxious about their financial situation, and that wasn't the case. So I thought this was an interesting insight.
Yeah, that's a great point. I definitely would agree with you in terms of, how this was able to bust some of our myths or some of our perceptions in terms of Hispanics, especially in the financial category.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So then when we looked at their spending, right, what we were able to find here was that Hispanics are less impulsive when they come to spending. So you'll see across both Hispanics and non-Hispanics that they're less impulsive when it comes to purchasing and how they're spending their money. Similarly, when we look at language preference, Spanish dominant Hispanics are less pragmatic than their English dominant counterparts. And then finally, from a generational perspective, we see that boomers are similarly less pragmatic. And I think, when I started to dive deeper into this and start to think of some of the reasons, those generational divides make sense in terms of how the spending, right? Whether they've come or they're immigrated from the US at an older and are now older and have had different life challenges. I think that also plays a role into the pragmatism in terms of how they're spending their money.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I just wanted to say that this is another one that surprised me, right? Because I think for years we've heard that the Hispanic market is much more impulsive, just across the board, especially when it comes to purchases, and less about long-term planning. And I think this debunked that mythology as well.
Yeah, and I think that further validation also in terms of the study itself, we traditionally see that English dominant Hispanics behave more so like the general market or the non-Hispanic population, and we see that that's right on par in terms of the pragmatism and the impulsiveness of the purchasing intent.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
And this one I appreciated from a qualitative perspective in terms of really understanding where it is that how their worry and their stress about money comes to life. And we see that there's a lot of similarity in the first two buckets against Hispanics and non-Hispanics, not being able to save money, living paycheck to paycheck. We saw that was similar, but what we see bubble up from a Hispanic perspective is not being able to assist family members financially. And also one that didn't show up at all for non-Hispanics is not owning a home or being able to afford a home. Where we see the non-Hispanic population is paying for necessities with credit card. And I think that this further validates that our first study in terms of the collective of Hispanics, in terms of being able to support that family, that nucleus, right? It's not just the immediate nucleus of their family, but also relatives, which is further validated in the study in a couple of slides.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, we tend to see that bubble up across the board, the collective versus the self-reliance, right? And being able to retire comfortably is a very self-reliant goal, right? It's very
Right.
much about you, the individual, versus this family and assisting your family members financially. That's much more of a collective objective. So agree 100%.
Yeah. And then this one, I love this one. And it also further validates that idea of collective, where we see that Hispanics are more likely to support family and relatives, both domestically and internationally. Specifically, when you look at Spanish dominant Hispanics, they're the ones that are supporting more internationally than domestically. But then you see bilingual Hispanics supporting, bilingual and English dominant Hispanics supporting more domestically than internationally. On this slide, what surprised me was the difference between boomers and then Generation Xers that are actually, the Gen X is supporting internationally more so than domestically, and the boomer supporting more domestically than internationally. So I found that to be interesting. I think from a Gen Xer, it's, either Hispanics living in the US that still have family members back in their country of origin. And we see that over indexes, but similarly having family members and relatives in the US and supporting them here too.
Yeah, and that I thought that was interesting too, Stephen. And this goes back a little bit to the study that we did earlier in the year about digital purchases and search, et cetera, that the Gen X were the ones most likely to be helping um, across the board, right? Outside and inside. And regarding the boomers, I think this makes a lot of sense if we think about it, right? Because they are more acculturated. So they are probably, and they're older, so they're more distant from their country of origin, right? Um, the thing that surprised me on this one was that non Hispanics, 35% were supporting family members domestically. I guess I wasn't thinking that would be the case, but sure, if they've got college kids or even elderly family members, it would make sense that they would be supporting them domestically.
Yeah, definitely interesting. And here, going back to that idea of the family being more than just direct nucleus, where do you find and learn about money? Hispanics tend to go to their parents from a financial perspective, but less so than their non-Hispanic counterparts. And you see here that they are more heavily reliant on their relatives than non-Hispanics. And also they're not looking at their schooling to provide that financial literacy. And they're also going to the internet, right? You just reiterated in terms of digital and their behaviors on digital and online to really go into that digital space as support and looking for information and researching online.
Yeah, and this was really interesting for a couple of reasons, but for me, I think the most significant one was that the relatives played such an important role in educating about finances, because I think that's a huge challenge because we have a lot of immigrants that are economic exiles, so they don't come to the US with financial literacy, if you will, right? So if they're the ones helping each other out, they're limiting their ability to assimilate financially, if you will, right? And to grow and experience the fruits of financial smarts. So that
Yeah.
was a little concerning as well as interesting. So we're finished on this section. Do you want to take questions, Stephen? If anyone has any questions on this first section,
I did not see any come up. So again, if you have any
this.
questions, feel free to pop them in. I do think also just to point out something here in terms of that impact of high school, right? Where that
Mm-hmm.
learning about finances, because I think it does pay off later on, right? When we talk about the time. So
Yes.
it is interesting how it all correlates, right? Like
Yes.
it gets validated in more than one area, these questions, regardless of how you ask. So
Yes. Uh, we do have a question. Which ethnic group are Hispanics most similar to?
hmm, I'm not clear.
Not sure.
Yeah, that
Can
one, I
you?
think
Yeah.
clarify more.
Yeah, Hugh, can you clarify that? I'm not sure because Hispanics are comprised of a lot of different ethnicities, right? They come from different countries of origin across LATAM and Spain. So I'm not sure what the question.
I'm wondering if he's asking in comparison to other ethnicities outside of Latin America or,
Mm,
racial groups.
maybe, yeah. Not ethnic related, but this financial topic. Oh, how they behave, I guess, to similar to other groups financially.
Yeah. I think here we're showing that definitely there's some nuances in comparison to non-Hispanics. So I think once you go deeper, you'll see more of the learnings that will be able to point out those differences as we go deeper into the presentation.
Yeah, and I think we might be asking also. So it would be, I would think the answer here lies in they would behave similarly financially to other economic exile immigrants that are coming to the U.S. from a collective culture. I think that's
I
how I
agree
would
with.
answer that. Okay, okay.
I agree
I
with that.
hope that answered
And
your question, Hugh.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that you answered his. Yeah, he further clarified. I think the
Okay.
next question, we're definitely going to get into that, Grace. So, great question. I think you set it up perfectly for Maria. Now that's going to take on the next section.
Yeah, great. Thanks. So now we're going to talk about Hispanics and financial institutions. Some interesting findings here as well. First of all, it probably comes as no surprise based on what we saw a little earlier that Hispanics have lower trust and don't feel very highly valued by financial institutions. So here's this circuitous integration that Stephen was talking about earlier, right? How do you feel in general about your financial institution? Well, 29% of Hispanics felt that they couldn't trust their financial institution versus 18% of non-Hispanics. And then when we asked, when you engage with your financial institution, do you feel highly valued, valued, or undervalued? And to no surprise, Hispanics were the ones least likely to be highly valued. Only 20%, 1 in 5, felt highly valued, and the number was higher for non-Hispanics. What I find interesting here also is if we go back to the first question about the trust, within that Hispanic market about not trusting, those that did trust the most were the bilingual millennials. They were the ones that felt highly valued. Let me clarify that. They're the ones who were feeling highly valued. So I think that's really interesting. There's something to be said about what group within each category of Hispanic versus non-Hispanic is feeling the value or feeling highly trusted. So I think boomers also feel highly valued, but that makes the most sense because they have more value to a financial institution. And bilinguals, again, highly valued because they are the ones that are probably doing a lot of the financial activity for family members. So there's something here, not just the overarching Hispanic versus non-Hispanic, but within acculturation levels, what the differences are.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when we look at these questions, right, there's a couple of things that come to mind, right? How do you feel in general about your financial institutions? I think that just that legacy of not being able to trust, from a country of origin perspective, how traditionally corrupt banks have been and whatnot, that leads to, an insecurity in terms of trust. But also at the core of the reason why we wanted to go down this financial journey was really understanding the Hispanic consumer to help brands be able to untap this underserved audience, right? Which I think is a main driver in terms of how they feel valued, because there's an underrepresentation in terms of advertising and communication towards Hispanics. that isn't at par with their non-Hispanic counterparts. So I do think that that has an influence in terms of being valued versus undervalued.
Yes, agree 100%. And definitely about the countries of origin, if there was distrust in financial institutions or all institutions in the countries of origin, that's not only brought here, but passed down to the kids, right? And if they're not learning in high school, then it perpetuates the whole situation. So we have a question here. You mentioned that boomers are more acculturated, but aren't they more likely to be less acculturated due to age? Being a boomer doesn't necessarily equate to being in the US long. Actually, this is a really interesting question, anonymous attendee. Boomers in our last study also were the more acculturated, right? So I think that's a really interesting question. And we talked in the last study that we did that we felt that the boomers were more acculturated because they grew up during a time where they had to acculturate in order to not only survive but to thrive. And we're seeing less of that now, where the younger generations, it's cool to have a Latino background and to be distinct, right? So there's less of that goal, if you will, to assimilate, and more of embrace who you are for the totality of who you are, which I think is interesting. Stephen, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think that's completely valid, right? And it's different now when younger generations, we're familiar with that retroculturation, right? Where they're trying to get back to their heritage, and be proud, to your point about being Latino. There's also no longer geographical boundaries in terms of being able to consume media from whatever source they want, allowing them to further expand their acculturation levels. And I definitely think that we continue to see that bicultural Hispanic to be more and more of the pie when you look at Hispanics versus that acculturation on either side, where they're fully acculturated or unacculturated. So.
Yeah, well said. There's another question here. Is the financial behavior of Hispanics the same in different states of the United States? For example, in Florida versus Montana? Great question, Javier. I think there are nuances across any metro area where there is a large Hispanic population. That said, I think, and we'll see this later, those that are over indexing in terms of mobile banking are probably doing so whether they're in a DMA with lots of Hispanics or not. So I think every DMA or every metro area has a nuance depending on the composition of a population. But these are definitely directional overall findings.
That next question from Robert. Robert, we're going to get into some of some findings, some key takeaways, and some recommendations. So definitely we'll answer your question in terms of how do you gain more trust. And then the next one, similarly, we'll be able to get into, some of our hypothesis or assumptions in terms of influencers versus financial institutions. So definitely stay tuned for that. And Maria, I think we've cleared all the questions for now.
All right. Next.
Yes.
All right. Hispanics have been with their banks for less time and start banking later in life than non-Hispanics. Again, let's look at this not as an isolated answer, but as part of a continuum here that we've started from the very beginning, and we're going to see this throughout. Half of Hispanics have been with their banks for less than 5 years. That's pretty incredible if you think about it, that half of them have only been with their banks for the last 5 years. And that means your banking relationship, right? So how long have you had your current banking relationship? Super interesting when you compare with non-Hispanics, who 40% of them have been with their banks for more than 10 years, right? And then on the flip side of that, when did they start banking? Like, at what age did you open your first bank account? I think this is really interesting. 43% of Hispanics, so not the majority, 43% were older than the age of 18. That seems very late to open an account. But again, it goes back to what we saw earlier: lack of trust. I don't feel very valued, and I'm learning from my family members or from online. I'm not learning in an educational setting, if you will, right? So this is all tied together. And if you look at it across acculturation level, 61% of the Spandom were over 18 when they opened their first bank account. Now, granted, the Spandom was probably a first generation immigrant, and we don't know at what age they came to the US. But regardless, there's ample opportunity for banks to move much quicker in terms of acquiring Hispanic markets and the Hispanic market and educating them, et cetera, which we'll talk about that later. Stephen, I don't know if you want to add anything to this.
No, I think that's exactly what I was alluding to earlier, right? When we looked at where they're getting information and financial education, they're not going to, traditional education sources. They're going more so either doing the research on their own or actually going to relatives and family members. So it is definitely is interesting.
Yeah, I think this is super interesting. On the next slide, Hispanics are far more likely to use mobile banking versus retail locations. So when it comes to what surprised you, was there a mythology that we're debunking in this research? This one was one for me, right? I had always heard my whole life, and in every study I had ever been involved with, it was all about the retail location, the friendly tellers, Spanish being spoken, et cetera, that Hispanics, because they are part of a collective culture and ethos, that's what they want. They want to connect and interact with others because they're interdependent by nature. We didn't see that here. We asked, if you bank on a regular basis, do you tend to use online or mobile banking or a physical bank? And look at these numbers. 59% of Hispanics are using online or mobile banking compared to 46% of non-Hispanics, and 30% of non-Hispanics are using physical banks versus 14% of Hispanics. Now, it's interesting for many reasons, right? If they're not supported in their physical bank with Hispanic personnel and someone who speaks Spanish, et cetera, you would argue, well, why would you ever go to a physical bank then if you can do it all mobily? We know that Hispanics were early adopters when it comes to mobile usage. So you could argue, well, so mobile banking makes more sense. Again, but is it also because they don't trust the financial institution, or they don't feel highly valued when they walk into a physical bank? Is that why they're banking mobily, or is it just more convenient? I mean, there's a lot of ways to slice and dice the data, but I think, again, this is all circuitous, and it goes back to what we started talking about earlier. Stephen, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think there's a couple of things. The more I look at this, the more interesting it gets to me. I do think we also have to take into account the methodology, right? This was 100% online. But with that being said as well, I think the question is very specific on where they're banking regularly, right? Like, to your point, in terms of ensuring that there's a customer experience in store that can deliver on their expectations is one that might be a deterrent for them to go into the physical banking. I also think that this pays off also in terms of the links that they've been banking with, right? So when have banks started to really rely heavily on mobile and applications? And it's been within probably the last less than 10 years, which talks to they're accustomed and kind of have started to already adjust to that new way of banking. And then also, we definitely know that everything we talk about Hispanics is that they're super users of mobile. So it just naturally tends to lend itself that they would over-index versus their non-Hispanics. But I do think, the more that we talked about this one and the more that I continue to see it, it's an interesting slide. And the question is definitely interesting. I just urge that not to completely discard the need for the physical banking and the experience to be aligned with the Hispanic experience, right? That's from either a new consumer perspective or from just that need of having that presence.
Yeah, agreed. We have a question here. As an immigrant Hispanic mom living in the US, I don't see lots of options for my kids to join a bank account. However, when I lived in Mexico, I opened my first account at 15 years with my parents because I started working. So, wondering where the young Hispanic workers are saving or investing their money. Ah, great question. I think that is the big question, right? What are they using for banking? Stephen, you want to add
Yeah.
something here?
I know. I think that's the big question mark, right? And that's one of the insights. It's we'll see at the end, but there's a huge opportunity, right? How do we ensure that we're being relevant with these younger generation of Hispanics, that we're going to be able to grow them into a consumer of a banking institution. So definitely it is something that I don't think is completely uncovered here in terms of how to overcome that challenge. But definitely it's something that needs to be addressed.
Yes, and there's a great comment here about I used to do physical banking, but there are mobile banking um, is inexpensive because the physical bank started charging a fee. So they encourage online mobile banking. B of A is an example of that. Would that be an insight for this? Absolutely. I think that would be a contributor for this as well. If you can avoid a fee and just do banking online, why wouldn't you just do that? And you may not live close to a bank, so you may have to take an Uber or a bus or something to get there. So there are a lot of reasons why mobile banking is very convenient, but it's interesting that to Stephen's point, for a bank to have a deeper relationship with the consumer, they need to see the consumer literally, and they need to hear that consumer, and they need to be able to reflect that consumer back in their journey.
Yeah, and I think that also lends itself to the time, right? Like the the banking experience has definitely been driven to more of a digital experience, especially heavily dependent on that mobile banking, which ties into the length of time that they've been banking. So definitely.
Yeah. And Elena asked, do you have a generational breakdown on mobile banking? Yes, I can provide that. If you want to drop in your email later, I can definitely, we can send you that. And someone is saying,
That's just a comment. So
oh, okay.
they're agreeing with us. So we
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Yeah, this is super interesting, right? Super interesting.
I think so.
There's more here. There's another question. Do you have any insights into consumer experience behaviors around varying financial products in terms of preferences for online versus physical, i.e. credit cards, checking accounts, mortgages, etc.?
I don't think we went that deep in the study,
We
no?
have we have some data, but it touches on that, but it's not as deep as that. We're going to see that coming up. I think we see some information on more
Yeah,
products information.
right, but not so much, when you're talking about the different services, like which ones are they doing more heavily online
Yes, that's true.
Versus in store. I
Physically, yeah.
think there's a couple of assumptions that we could make, but definitely it wasn't something we went as deep to understand.
Right. And then there's one more, the growth of digital banking. Isn't it still a physical banking mentality made smaller to fit a phone? Yeah, I guess in many ways. It is a physical banking experience that fits in a phone. Stephen, you want to say something?
Yeah, yeah, I would say yes.
All right, great. Yeah, lots of interesting thoughts around this. I appreciate everyone's comments. I think we both do. All right. Not only are Hispanics more likely to use mobile banking, but they are power users. So look at this. What do they use it for? Hispanics are more likely than non-Hispanics to use their mobile banking for checking balances, making payments or paying bills, check deposits, transferring money to individuals. We saw how important, we'll see a little later too, how important that is. And we saw earlier how important it is for international and domestic, and transferring between accounts at other banks. So they're not just using it for, oh, let me just check my balance. They're using it across the board. and they are less likely to care about physical bank amenities. This is interesting. What factors are most important to you when you selected your primary bank? Again, this one surprised me. Non-Hispanics cared more about friendly tellers than Hispanics. Super surprised here. I would have thought that would have gone the other way. And non-Hispanics care more about a local presence than Hispanics. Well, if they're heavy mobile bank users, the fact that there isn't a local presence makes sense to me. And the fact that friendly tellers are less important because I'm online doing this mobily. I don't need a friendly teller. But it's still surprising because historically we have seen, or I've definitely seen in research, that the friendly tellers and a local presence were important. And again, this could also be a product of if you did this study in a heavy Hispanic DMA, we may have different results, but this was a national study. Stephen, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think it goes back to similarly on the other slide, like the length of banking that influences, you know, that it's been kind of as banking evolves, it's been more and more focused on that mobile experience. So I think that again, they've become accustomed to prioritizing that experience versus, you know, they didn't have a previous experience from a legacy bank in terms of what, you know, what exists. So I think that mindset has shifted. So I do believe that that's probably one of the, but to your point, I think that's a very valid point in terms of the DMA and the need of that physical store.
Yeah, agreed. And we have a question here, are they using mobile banking in Spanish? Well, we know that's definitely the preference, right? That's been clear in the research. We have another question. Many of our Latinx clients struggle with digital literacy. We also see a lack of financial wellness education. Is there a recommendation for curriculum or activities-based education that allows this population to gain confidence in these skills? We hope to see an uptick of generational knowledge from Latinx households into building generational wealth. Yes, stay tuned because we're going to cover that in a second with our recommendations. Great. All right, so we'll go on to the next one here. Hispanics often translate financial information for family. This is one that is very close to Stephen and my heart. Translating, interpreting information is always the role that is played by whoever serves as the Sherpa, if you will, for the family, right? So this is super interesting because Hispanics are more likely, obviously, than other groups to translate or interpret financial information for the family. We asked if you always do it or sometimes do it, right? So across the board, 62% said they translate or interpret because, again, there is lack of financial literacy, no deep understanding of the financial lexicon, and these are all new products, all new terms, and someone has to take the burden of doing the translating, right? Now, the Spanish dominant, the bilingual, and the English dominant, just look at these numbers. The bilingual are the most likely to report that they're always translating for their family when it comes to financial information. But across the board, everyone, the Span Dom and the bilingual are doing it more so than the English dominant. Again, as we talked about, in both of these studies, we've seen that the English dominant are more acculturated, and so they're more likely removed, whether physically or emotionally, from their Latino roots or their family members. Maybe that may be one of the reasons. So they're less close to the immigrant experience because they're further away from it. So they don't have that sphere that they have to translate for. When it comes to millennials, Gen X, and boomers, millennials were the ones that were reporting that, yes, I always have to translate. But across the board, look at these numbers, millennials, Gen X, and boomers, everyone is involved. Again, The boomers, in this case, a little less. It was 57% if you look at the yes always and the yes sometimes. But the Gen X and the millennials are doing it. So there is definitely an opportunity for financial institutions to remove the onus and the burden from these cohorts, to have to take this responsibility, translating financial information. We also then asked, what would make you switch a bank? 30% of the span dom, I think that someone asked this question a minute ago, would switch banks for a mobile banking in Spanish. So if there was mobile banking in Spanish, 30% of the span dom would switch. 29% of the span dom say a mobile app in Spanish was an important factor in selecting their bank. So many are already with banks because of the Spanish mobile app, and many would be willing to switch if there was a Spanish mobile app. So for all of you financial institutions out there that have a Spanish mobile app, do some more advertising, because there's a lot of Hispanics willing to switch. And then 22% of the span dom and 16% of millennials would switch for Spanish speaking personnel. So interesting. Again, we know that a lot of these individuals play the role of Sherpas for their families. We see here that the bilingual are always playing that role when it comes to financials, and that the millennials are most likely to always be playing that role when compared to the other cohorts. But everyone's doing it to some degree. So assisting these individuals helps any financial institution, because these are the individuals that are the influencers more often than not. So by investing in removing the burden from them, you're going to get a greater ROI. That's been my experience over the years working with different brands. Stephen, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think everything that you said makes sense, and I support it. It just, again, right, the idea of where they're getting information, that translation, that they need to go deeper into their family ties to be able to get more information. So this just, it lends itself as to where they're getting that information rather than the traditional routes that we see for their non-Hispanic counterparts.
Yep. All right, we're going to move on to the next section, with Stephen's going to take over. And I'm looking at the clock. We've got 15 minutes, so I think we're doing good. All right.
All right, so let's talk about Hispanics and their financial future. So again, when we started on the journey of trying to determine what topics we wanted to really lean into and discuss, financial bubbled up to the top, because we wanted to see what were the opportunities. How can we, be able to address some of the barriers, and where there's a huge opportunity when you think about Hispanics in terms of financing. So we see here that they have an under index in terms of mortgage loans compared to 25% of non-Hispanics, but we know that the loans, we continue to see a tremendous amount of growth in home ownership against Hispanics. So there is currently an under index, but we continue to see that growth. And similarly across all of these different products, right, 401k, retirement accounts, and stocks, there is an under index, but it's a huge opportunity. And I think also it lends itself to what we've been talking about in terms of financial education and financial literacy, that they're yearning for better understanding of these different types of products. There was a question before in terms of, where is that banking, how are the different types of banking happening? So we break down here in terms of usage, but we don't know specifically if this is a more mobile experience or a more of an in-store experience, but it's definitely, and I don't want to speak for Maria, in my opinion, it's definitely a need for education and how to properly invest into these different types of areas. From my perspective as well, it didn't surprise me tremendously in terms of crypto and crypto assets, right? Where that is really the lowest gap that we see in terms of where Hispanics are investing versus non-Hispanics, right? It's a newer type of investment opportunity. It's heavily dependent on mobile, and it's also an international form of investment. So I think all of those lend itself to that gap not being as wide as, the traditional US focused type of financial institution and financial products.
Yeah, agree 100%. And yes, 100%. No surprise on the crypto early adopters of all
Yeah.
things digital, right? But these other traditional financial vehicles, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. All right, let's go to the next one.
And this one, I always love when there's a payout from the pot. Like it's like it really was real. In our previous, the Hispanic journey, one of the things that was that came out was Hispanics tend to go to a brand's digital store or digital utilize a brand's digital page or their digital assets more so than non-Hispanics, and we see that here as well, whereas they're going to a banking institution, to a financial institution to look for resources, and they're also going to the website as well, like various websites. I think from a platform perspective, it's really not surprising to me in terms of YouTube being such so heavily dependent for Spanish dominant. As Hispanics are over indexing in terms of usage of social network and YouTube, they're going there because the content doesn't exist in a culturally relevant and language specific way where they can consume it. So that's where they're turning to more of these non-traditional user generated community collective type of behaviors in terms of going into social networking and YouTube. And you see that more dependent as the language barriers start to increase, right? From English dominant to Spanish dominant, they become more dependent on different types of media platforms.
Absolutely. Super interesting. And, I wanted to add something real quick here because it came up in a study involved in a couple of years ago where we studied a lot of the minority markets, and there was concern about going into financial institutions because then the banks could see what the appearances were and they could make biases on the individual based on their ethnicity or their race. And I think that's another reason that I wanted to mention that earlier, that mobile is attractive, whether it's overt or covert and people are aware of it or not. It's like they're anonymous. And we see here, if I can go online and learn on YouTube about finances, then I don't have to be embarrassed and ask someone else that would assume that they already know this and have a bias against me, right?
That's hugely valid as well. Cool.
We have a question here. Why don't we finish this and then we'll finish the questions. Why don't we do that? Good. Okay. Yeah. All right. Next.
And I think this also pays off in terms of how, there were a couple of questions in terms of how and what Hispanics are looking for from a financial institution. And there's some variance between Spanish dominant versus English dominant and bilingual, but it was very interesting to see one area that rose for all three of them, in my opinion, and that was seminars on opening my own business. I think that was very interesting, that entrepreneurial spirit that, Hispanics, like that optimism, that American dream, right, that really lends itself to opening a business and becoming an entrepreneur. We've been talking about this a lot in terms of, Spanish dominant Hispanics yearning for banking with their family, to not be so heavily dependent on having to be the lead from that perspective. Education across credit as well. And then we see it across the board, right? I think at the end of the day, it's the need for education and learning in terms of, some of those gaps. We see course for securing a mortgage that popped as well. So
yeah, super interesting. I think it goes back to how we started this whole presentation. Where are they getting the information from? If they're not getting it from their high school, the onus is for the financial institutions to provide it.
Yeah.
Next.
All right, let's get to that question and then we could wrap it up.
Okay, let's do that. So the question is, why we are not in the banking business and very invigorating. how does all this apply to B2B insurance products offered digitally? Primarily property liability and workers' comp, or Spanish businesses open to do it yourself, their business insurance online? Great question. Hugh, we didn't probe these specifically. We didn't probe about liability and workers' comp, et cetera. So I guess one could argue, yes, maybe they'd be more open to doing a lot of this online. But I don't have the research to validate that, so I don't want to share that as an absolute truth. Stephen, I don't know if you
Yeah, I
have
agree.
anything.
I'm not familiar in terms of being able to answer that question. Do financial terms change a lot from country to country? If a financial institution is to offer something in Spanish, should they offer it in Mexican Spanish? I think from, it's dependent, and especially if you're going local, in my opinion, I think there should always be a neutrality behind either language usage or voicing it. So there should be some form of neutrality. I don't foresee that there's that much of a dialect difference between country to country. But I do think that definitely, in my experience, there's always a way to be neutral where you're not pushing away a certain ethnicity versus another ethnicity.
Agreed. And do Hispanic buyers always go for Spanish language or prefer to have a choice between Spanish and English? I think it depends on their level of acculturation, to be perfectly honest. I think sometimes it's always Spanish. Yeah, it really depends.
And they have the choice. I think the choice is always important. I think the preference is what's going to determine whether they go to Spanish and English. And also we started off the conversation in terms of trust, and there's a legacy belief that in some of other research that I've seen in terms of Hispanics tend to think that if it's in Spanish, it's a subpar offer versus non-Hispanic versus in English.
English,
so
yeah.
If there's a way that you can create the experience in both English and Spanish and give them the opportunity to select, it would be my opinion, and then also ensuring that the information is similar. All right, Let me take us into our first key takeaway and implications. So as we saw early on in the presentation, Hispanics, and this also delivers on the belief of the collective that they're supporting both relatives, both domestically and internationally. So our recommendation and implication is create a functional way for money to be sent both domestically and internationally. So if a banking institution has the opportunity to create that mobile experience where it can facilitate that opportunity to transfer money, that would be definitely a huge advantage for Hispanics, knowing that they're over-indexing in terms of supporting and sending money to relatives. And then how do we ensure that there's language specificity, kind of what we just talked about, that dual language and that option to be able to choose and select whether they want to do the banking or the transfer, or that opportunity in the language of that they are more comfortable in.
Yeah, right. And then, we saw that they have lower trust and feel less valued. Oh, okay. So that's all tied to, first of all, not being seen or mirrored or reflected back in these institutions. So ensure that communications are built on culturally relevant insights and in language. So if they're culturally relevant, but they're all in English, it's not going to work. And if they're all in Spanish, but they're not culturally relevant, it's not going to work. So you really need to be in culture in language, and showcase the security that a long-term banking relationship can provide across product categories, right? Share customer stories, share testimonials, let the consumers tell the story and why the banking relationship was important to them, pivotal in their experience here. I think that's really important. What did it allow them to secure? And then have consistent dual language evergreen campaigns throughout the year, create a memorable and impactful community presence. So you definitely want to have that overarching presence So you're not just coming in during Hispanic Heritage Month, for example, and then acting like the Hispanic market doesn't exist the rest of the year. That's wrong, and it's almost more negative than not coming in at all, right? So make sure you've got air cover throughout the year. You're always driving awareness and acquisition, but that you also make an impact at the community level. So they feel that you are, it's a brand that's close to them, not just physically, but emotionally as well.
Yeah, I think Elena had just asked a question in terms of how important cultural relevance is, and it's definitely
Okay.
a critical component, and I think you answered that there.
Okay.
We have
All
2
right.
minutes.
Last takeaways here.
All right, sorry, I was reading the question. You know, we've talked about this a bit, especially in terms of how accustomed they are to mobile banking. Hispanics tend to have had banking relations for a shorter time and start banking at a later age. How can we ensure that there is material that can leverage, that can be leveraged to demystify both banking and the prevalence of financial opportunities? So as we talked about, you know, where's that gap? How can we ensure that they're going and they're being taken along in that financial journey where it starts from a traditional bank checking account to then really that taking them onto the journey of more of those financial products. And then, you know, we talked about this earlier, and there was a question in terms of what's that silver bullet in terms of being able to get younger Hispanics to start banking at, or getting Hispanics to start banking at a younger age. And I think it's very heavily dependent on being involved in the community, that education for both the parents and the children in terms of, you know, the benefits of having a banking relationship from a young age.
True. Yeah. And then finally, Hispanics turn to digital resources for information first. So if we know that, right? If we know that outside of their family, they're going online to find information, develop a consumer journey that delivers in both languages from the onset, right? So create that engagement, right? Early. So if they're going to search for something, ask them, where are you in the process? You know, what do you know? Take a little quiz, you know, how can we help you? And then create a multi-tiered campaign of information, if you will, that walks them through the consumer journey at their own pace. We saw that they want to be educated. Start at the beginning, find out where they are from a baseline perspective, then create a consumer journey that educates them both in English and in the Spanish, so they can early on see you as their Sherpa, if you will, when it comes to developing financial literacy.
Well, we're at time. So this was fun as always, Maria. It's such a pleasure always speaking with you, but
It's so much
especially
fun.
sharing the screen with you. So
I know. It is
thank you
fun.
so
It was
much.
great. Thank you. I certainly enjoyed it. And thank you all for attending, and happy
Yes.
holidays and happy new year. And we'll be back next year with more to share for sure.
Yes. Again, thank you for everyone joining us. Have a great day.
Yes. Have a great one. Thank you. Bye-bye.